Welcome back to our channel. Today, we're looking into the haunting origins of Pedro Alonso Lopez, infamously known as the Monster of the Andes. Before his reign of terror gripped South America, a disturbing childhood set the stage for his monstrous crimes. Love true crime? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories. Let's start at the very beginning. A troubled birth in a turbulent time. Pedro Alonso Lopez entered this world on October 8, 1948, in the small municipality of Santa Isabel, Colombia. From the very start, his life was marred by violence and loss. Pedro never knew his father, Medardo Reyes, a soldier involved in Colombia's bloody civil conflict known as La Violencia. Medardo was murdered 6 months before Pedro was born. Imagine being brought into a world where the very fabric of your family is torn apart by political violence. Pedro's mother, Benilda Lopez de Castañeda, was left to raise 13 children, including Pedro, entirely on her own. Benilda worked as a laundrywoman, but Pedro would later claim that she also engaged in sex work, a profession that he said exposed her to frequent abuse at the hands of clients. Whether or not this is true, one thing is clear. The household was far from stable. Pedro, the seventh of 13 children, grew up in a volatile and abusive environment, one where he felt neglected and often invisible. Childhood shadows, abuse, and isolation. Pedro's early years were riddled with experiences that no child should endure. He would later accuse his mother of being physically abusive, claiming she frequently beat him and his siblings. While some survivors of abusive households grow stronger from their trauma, Pedro seemed to internalize this pain in the worst possible ways, bottling up anger and resentment that would later explode with terrifying consequences. When Pedro was just 8 years old, his life took an even darker turn. One day, Benilda allegedly caught him fondling his younger sister. This event, whether born out of confusion or something more sinister, marked a pivotal moment in his life. Furious and disgusted, Benilda reportedly banished him from the family home. Imagine an 8-year-old child, now homeless, wandering the streets with nowhere to turn. That act of rejection would haunt Pedro for the rest of his life, feeding into his already growing bitterness toward the world. Life on the streets, Bogotá's lost children. After being cast out, Pedro found himself in the bustling streets of Bogotá, Colombia's capital city. Here, he became one of the gamines, a term for homeless children who roamed the streets, scavenging for food and surviving any way they could. Bogotá at the time was a harsh place for a child to grow up, let alone a child with no home or family to rely on. Pedro quickly learned that the streets were no safer than his abusive home. He was vulnerable and frequently preyed upon by older street kids and adults alike. Pedro later revealed that during this period, he was repeatedly sexually assaulted by strangers. One particularly harrowing incident involved a man luring him in with the promise of food and shelter, only to drag him to an abandoned building and assault him. These events cemented a deep-seated hatred and mistrust of humanity in Pedro, along with a burning desire for vengeance. To survive, Pedro joined a gang of other homeless children, seeking safety in numbers. These groups were often violent and involved in petty crimes like theft and drug use. For Pedro, this was the beginning of a long descent into a life of violence. At a tender age, his innocence was stolen, and the seeds of his monstrous future were sown. If you're finding this story both chilling and fascinating, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more investigative looks into the darkest corners of human history. A glimmer of hope, adoption, and betrayal. In a rare twist of fortune, when Pedro was 10 years old, an elderly American couple found him wandering the streets. They took him in, offering him a home and enrolling him in a school for orphans. For a brief moment, it seemed like Pedro's life might take a turn for the better. He finally had stability, food, and a chance at education. But this glimmer of hope was cruelly snatched away. At the school, Pedro claimed he was sexually abused yet again, this time by a teacher. The betrayal shattered any trust Pedro had in authority figures or the possibility of a better life. At the age of 12, he fled from the school, returning to the streets he once called home. Pedro would later confess that this incident filled him with a simmering rage and a thirst for revenge against those he perceived as his oppressors. The birth of a killer's mindset. Pedro's early years were a storm of trauma, rejection, and violence. By the time he reached his late teens, he had already endured more pain and suffering than most people could imagine. These formative experiences, the abuse, neglect, and constant betrayal, didn't just shape his worldview, they twisted it beyond recognition. Pedro grew to see himself as a victim of an unjust world, one where power was taken by force and survival meant preying on others before they could prey on him. By 1969, at the age of 21, Pedro had started down a path of crime. He was arrested for stealing a car, an offense that landed him in prison. Far from rehabilitating him, his time behind bars only deepened his hatred for society. In prison, Pedro was once again a victim, this time raped by multiple inmates. But in a chilling display of his capacity for violence, Pedro exacted his revenge by killing his attackers with a homemade knife. This act solidified a dangerous pattern. Anyone who wronged him would face his wrath. A monster in the making. Pedro Alonso López's early life reads like a catalog of horrors, a tragic story of a child failed at every turn by the people and institutions that should have protected him. While his experiences don't excuse the atrocities that he would go on to commit, they offer a disturbing glimpse into the mind of a man shaped by violence and trauma. In our next section, we'll delve into how Pedro's traumatic past gave way to a killing spree so prolific it earned him the title, the Monster of the Andes. Don't miss it. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest of this harrowing tale. Pedro Alonso López, the Monster of the Andes, the series of murders. In the vast and sometimes unforgiving landscapes of South America, one name would eventually become infamous for the unimaginable horrors it's tied to. That name, of course, is Pedro Alonso López, also known as the Monster of the Andes, a name that sends shivers down the spine and is forever associated with one of the most terrifying and prolific serial killers in history. But what led Lopez to commit such unspeakable crimes? What was it about his journey through life that culminated in the brutal killing spree he embarked on, targeting the most vulnerable victims, young girls? Before we dive into the heart of his reign of terror, we need to piece together the disturbing series of events that unfolded across multiple countries. The early beginnings of a murderous path. By 1978, Lopez had already endured a life that was a cocktail of abuse, neglect, and suffering. After his release from prison, which had been marked by violence and a thirst for revenge against his childhood tormentors, he began to travel across South America. It was during this period that his violent tendencies found a disturbing outlet. Initially, his actions were more impulsive, driven by a compulsive need to dominate and harm. But by the time he reached Peru, Lopez had transformed into a predator with a terrifying method of operation. He started targeting young girls, usually from indigenous backgrounds or lower socioeconomic classes, those who were most vulnerable and, tragically, less likely to be missed. The stories of these girls, their innocence stolen in the most brutal way, became the foundation of Lopez's horrifying legacy. Now, let's take a deeper look at how his crimes unfolded. Peru, the first victims. Lopez's journey in Peru is one of the darkest chapters in his murderous career. Moving from place to place, he would typically approach young girls in public spaces, often in remote areas, where they were less likely to attract attention. His method was chillingly calculated. He would lure them away from safety with some small trinket or offer of help, only to violently assault and ultimately murder them. His victims, he later confessed, were predominantly street children or those from indigenous tribes. The poverty-stricken streets of Peru were teeming with young girls with nowhere to go, and Lopez found them to be easy prey. His method was straightforward. He'd offer them something, sometimes a piece of jewelry, sometimes the promise of something better, and once they were out of sight, he'd strike. His preferred method of killing? Strangulation, often using his bare hands. a deeply personal form of violence that allowed him to feel an added sense of control and power over his victims. But the most haunting part of his time in Peru came when he was briefly captured by a tribe of 𝐬𝐿𝐾𝐿. Lopez had attempted to abduct a 9-year-old girl, a crime that would later prove to be a turning point in his grisly spree. The 𝐬𝐿𝐾𝐿, a community of indigenous people, did not take kindly to outsiders harming their children. They captured Lopez, stripped him of his clothes, and buried him in the sand. A ritualistic form of punishment, but one that would have been Lopez's end if not for an American missionary who convinced the tribe to release him and turn him over to the police. You might think that this would have been the end of Lopez's killing spree, but the authorities failed to see the bigger picture. They didn't take the threat seriously enough, and Lopez was simply deported back to Colombia. A missed opportunity to stop one of the world's most prolific serial killers, and yet another demonstration of how overlooked the suffering of the most vulnerable in society often is. Ecuador, the killing spree continues. After being sent back to Colombia, Lopez didn't stop. In fact, he was far from finished. His thirst for violence, for domination, for control, he needed it, and he was willing to travel far and wide to get it. By the early 1980s, Lopez had crossed the border into Ecuador. Here, his reign of terror would reach its peak. The Ecuadorian countryside, much like the areas in Peru, offered Lopez the perfect conditions for his killing spree. A lack of widespread police surveillance and vast, often unpatrolled areas made it easy for him to abduct girls, often from poor families or those living on the streets. It's not clear how many victims Lopez claimed in Ecuador, but the scale of his crimes here was staggering. He would later boast that he had murdered over 200 people in the country alone. His methodology remained disturbingly consistent. He'd lure young girls away from public spaces, sometimes with the promise of food, sometimes with small gifts, and then he would take them to isolated areas. There, he would rape and strangle them, again, often using his bare hands, leaving behind little evidence except for the lifeless bodies of his victims. But it wasn't just the acts themselves that were horrifying. What came afterward was equally chilling. Lopez spoke almost casually about digging up the bodies of his victims from their graves. He described having tea parties with the bodies, a macabre ritual that showed just how far his psyche had deteriorated. It was as if, for him, the violence and death weren't enough. He had to continue to exert control, even over the lifeless bodies of those he had murdered. The moment of capture. Lopez's spree of terror eventually began to unravel. In April of 1980, a flash flood in the area surrounding Ambato, Ecuador, unearthed the remains of several young girls who had been missing for some time. Their bodies, lying exposed and unceremoniously discarded, were a stark reminder that the disappearances of young girls in the area were far from ordinary. The floodwaters revealed what the police had been unable or unwilling to see. The bodies were linked to a series of disappearances, and the authorities finally took notice. Yet it wasn't until an attempted abduction in broad daylight that Lopez was finally apprehended. Carvina Poveda, a local woman, was on her way to the market with her 12-year-old daughter Mary when Lopez attempted to abduct the girl. This time, however, the community wasn't going to let him slip through their fingers. Local merchants who witnessed the abduction attempt were able to overpower Lopez and hold him until the police arrived. It was a rare moment of triumph in a long and painful history of tragic disappearances. The investigation begins. Once in police custody, Lopez initially refused to cooperate. It wasn't until he was placed in a cell with a police captain posing as a fellow prisoner that the confessions began to pour out. When he finally spoke, it was with chilling ease, as if he was recounting an ordinary event. Lopez confessed to murdering over 300 people, claiming that he killed at least 200 girls in Ecuador alone, with many more in Colombia and Peru. His method of operation remained the same throughout the years, luring his victims, assaulting them, and then strangling them to death. The way he spoke about his killings suggested that he saw himself as an agent of some twisted form of justice, a man who had been wronged in his youth and now sought to do the same to others. His rationalization, if it could even be called that, was chilling in its simplicity. "I lost my innocence at the age of 8, so I decided to do the same to as many girls as I could." A statement that, once heard, is never easily forgotten. But the confessions didn't stop there. Lopez would guide the authorities to the bodies of 53 victims, confirming the police's worst fears. And his confessions continued to uncover more and more horror as the investigation unfolded. Lopez's modus operandi. Lopez's approach to targeting victims was both calculated and sinister. He would often scout public spaces, markets, bus terminals, or isolated villages where young girls from impoverished backgrounds or indigenous communities roamed freely, unsupervised. These locations were ideal hunting grounds because they were frequented by children left to their own devices. Once he identified a potential victim, Lopez would approach them with an air of friendliness, offering small gifts like candy, toys, or trinkets. These items, though trivial, were enough to gain the trust of vulnerable children. He would lure them to secluded areas, often under the pretense of giving them something or playing a game. Once isolated, he would reveal his true intentions. The murders followed a consistent pattern. After sexually assaulting his victims, Lopez would strangle them with his bare hands. This deeply personal method gave him an added sense of control. He once admitted that he derived pleasure not only from the act itself, but also from watching the life leave his victims' eyes. It was the ultimate expression of dominance for him. A ritualistic component. What set Lopez apart from many other serial killers was the ritualistic aspect of his crimes. In some cases, he didn't simply kill and leave the bodies behind. He returned to the graves of his victims. He later described how he would dig up their corpses to play with them, or host what he chillingly referred to as tea parties. Lopez reportedly seated the bodies in a circle, speaking to them as though they were alive, in a grotesque mockery of companionship. This ritual was not just a sign of his deranged mental state, but also an indication of how detached he was from reality. His actions extended beyond murder. They reflected a profound lack of humanity and an obsession with control, even after his victims were dead. Estimated victim count. Lopez claimed to have killed over 300 girls, 100 in Colombia, around 110 in Ecuador, and dozens more in Peru. While authorities confirmed 110 of these murders through the recovery of remains and confessions, Lopez himself boasted of many more. However, due to the remote locations where the crimes were committed and the lack of proper documentation in the areas he targeted, the true number of his victims may never be known. The vast majority of his victims were young girls between the ages of 8 and 12. He deliberately chose children because they were easier to manipulate and less likely to fight back. This preference, combined with the social neglect of indigenous and impoverished communities in South America, allowed him to go unnoticed for years. The Peruvian interruption. In Peru, Lopez's crimes came closest to being stopped early. After attempting to kidnap a 9-year-old girl from an 𝐽𝐿𝐾𝐭 indigenous community, he was captured by the tribe. Enraged at his actions, the community decided to take justice into their own hands. They stripped him naked, confiscated his belongings, and buried him up to his neck in sand, preparing to kill him. Tribal law would have ended Lopez's reign of terror right there, but fate intervened in the form of an American missionary. The missionary, either out of mercy or a misguided belief in rehabilitation, convinced the tribe to spare his life and handed him over to the authorities. Tragically, Peruvian police saw Lopez as little more than a nuisance and deported him to Colombia without conducting any thorough investigation or even considering the possibility that he might have committed further atrocities. This moment is often regarded as one of the most significant missed opportunities to stop Lopez before his killing spree escalated. Patterns of fear and silence. What made Lopez so effective at evading capture for so long was the silence of the communities he targeted. Many of his victims came from indigenous groups or impoverished families who were often marginalized by society and overlooked by the authorities. In these communities, the disappearances of young girls were often dismissed as cases of runaway children or even attributed to human trafficking. The lack of resources and attention given to these cases allowed Lopez to move freely between Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. While locals often whispered of a monster preying on their children, these fears rarely reached the ears of law enforcement in a meaningful way. The flood that unveiled the horror. In Ecuador, Lopez's crimes reached their horrifying peak. By 1980, he was operating with shocking impunity, continuing to abduct and kill young girls. However, a natural disaster in Ambato would prove to be a turning point. Flash floods swept through the area, unearthing shallow graves and revealing the skeletal remains of multiple children. These remains were linked to reports of missing girls, prompting a renewed investigation by local police. The discovery confirmed what some families had long suspected. Their children had not simply wandered off or been taken by traffickers. They had fallen victim to a serial predator who was able to exploit the vulnerabilities of the region. The failed kidnapping that ended it all. Lopez's capture in Ambato came after yet another brazen attempt to abduct a child. This time, his intended victim was Mary Poveda, the 12-year-old daughter of a local woman, Carvina Poveda. Lopez tried to lure Mary away, but his actions were noticed by local merchants in the area. A crowd quickly formed, and the merchants apprehended Lopez before he could escape. By the time police arrived, Lopez was already restrained, and the community demanded answers. This incident marked the end of his killing spree, but it would also open the door to one of the most horrifying confessions in criminal history. Impact on the community. Lopez's crimes left a scar that would never heal in the regions he targeted. Families who had lost their daughters struggled with the knowledge that their children had been taken in such brutal ways. Many indigenous communities, already marginalized, became even more distrustful of outsiders. Authorities too faced harsh criticism for their handling of the case. The fact that Lopez was able to move so freely across borders and continue his spree for years highlighted major flaws in the policing systems of South America during that time. It also underscored the societal neglect of impoverished indigenous populations, whose cries for justice were often ignored. Like and subscribe for more investigations. The capture in Ecuador, when the monster was cornered. By the late 1970s, Lopez's trail of terror had extended to Ecuador, where he continued his horrifying spree, preying on young girls from impoverished or indigenous communities. Parents were desperate, often taking the search for their missing daughters into their own hands. One mother even published ads in local newspapers, hoping to find any clue about her child's fate. The turning point came in Ambato, Ecuador in 1980. A street vendor named Carlina Ramon caught Lopez attempting to lure her daughter from a bustling market. A group of outraged locals quickly detained him and handed him over to police. Initially, Lopez refused to cooperate. It seemed like another dead end, but one investigator, Pastor Cordova Gudino, had a cunning idea. Disguised as an inmate, Gudino infiltrated Lopez's world and gained his trust. In what can only be described as a breakthrough in undercover policing, Lopez confessed to the murders and provided chilling details about the locations of his victims' graves. Authorities uncovered the remains of 57 young girls, a discovery that both confirmed Lopez's guilt and gave grieving families a semblance of closure. Despite this, the full scale of his crimes remained unimaginable. Lopez boasted of killing over 300 girls, a claim he maintained throughout his life. But here's the most shocking twist. In July of 1981, Lopez pleaded guilty to 57 murders and was sentenced to just 16 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time. A justice system stretched thin. Imagine hearing that a man who murdered 57 children and claimed to have killed hundreds more would only spend 16 years behind bars. The public outrage in Ecuador was immense. Many questioned how a justice system could fail so spectacularly. In response to Lopez's case, Ecuador later increased its maximum prison sentence to 25 years. But for the families of Lopez's victims, this change came far too late. For Lopez, prison was little more than a temporary inconvenience. Diagnosed as a sociopath, he showed no signs of remorse. Instead, he continued to refer to himself as the man of the century, basking in the notoriety his crimes had brought him. It was a terrifying glimpse into his unrepentant psyche, but the nightmare wasn't over. 1994. Freedom for good behavior? On August 31, 1994, Lopez was released from Ecuador's Garcia Moreno prison. Yes, you heard that right. After serving just 14 years, 2 years shy of his already limited sentence, he was let go for good behavior. If the thought of releasing a confessed mass murderer back into society doesn't make your blood boil, consider this. Lopez walked free without facing charges for the additional murders he claimed to have committed in Colombia and Peru. The release was met with widespread disbelief and condemnation. How could someone with such a heinous record be deemed fit for reintegration into society? Even Lopez himself seemed to revel in the absurdity of the situation. In an interview just before his release, he declared himself a changed man, though his actions following his release would prove otherwise. Deported to Colombia, a second chance at justice? After his release, Lopez was deported to his home country of Colombia, where authorities immediately detained him for entering as an illegal immigrant. This brief flicker of hope that Colombia might hold him accountable for his past crimes was short-lived. Prosecutors attempted to build a case against him for a 2-decades-old murder, but the evidence was insufficient. Instead of facing a trial, Lopez was declared insane and committed to a psychiatric hospital in 1995. At this point, it seemed like the system was trying to contain him, albeit in a less than ideal way. Institutionalizing Lopez may have kept him off the streets temporarily, but the leniency of his treatment raised serious concerns. For someone who had committed such unfathomable acts, was a mental hospital really the right place? 1998, declared sane and released. In February 1998, another shocking decision was made. Lopez was declared sane and released from the psychiatric facility on a bail of just $70. Yes, for the price of a modest dinner, Lopez gained his freedom once again. Authorities imposed a condition that he report periodically to the police, but this too was meaningless. Lopez immediately absconded, vanishing into thin air. One of his first known actions after his release was a visit to his elderly mother. The interaction was as cold and transactional as you might expect. Lopez reportedly demanded his inheritance, but when his mother explained that she had nothing to give, he sold her bed and chair to strangers on the street. Then, without a shred of remorse or gratitude, he disappeared. The last sighting and renewed fear. The last confirmed sighting of Pedro Alonso Lopez came in September 1999, when he visited Colombia's National Civil Registry to renew his citizenship card. After that, he seemingly vanished, leaving a trail of fear and speculation in his wake. Authorities feared that Lopez, now a free man, had returned to his old ways. In 2002, Colombian police and Interpol issued warrants for his arrest in connection with a murder that bore striking similarities to his previous crimes. The international community was on high alert, but the trail went cold. By 2005, Interpol deactivated its warrant, effectively closing the case. Lopez had once again slipped through the cracks. Even more disturbingly, Lopez has been named as a possible suspect in a homicide committed in Tunja, Colombia in 2012. Though no concrete evidence ties him to the crime, the mere suggestion that he could still be active is enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. A system that failed us all. The story of Pedro Alonso Lopez isn't just about one man's monstrous crimes. It's a tale of systemic failure at every turn. From Ecuador's lenient sentencing laws to Colombia's inability to prosecute him effectively, Lopez exploited every loophole to continue evading justice. Even after his confessions, which detailed hundreds of murders, he managed to walk free, not once, but multiple times. How does a man like Lopez escape justice time and time again? The answer lies in a combination of poor coordination between countries, inadequate legal frameworks, and societal indifference toward the plight of marginalized communities. Most of Lopez's victims came from impoverished or indigenous backgrounds, groups that are often overlooked by the justice system. This neglect allowed him to operate with near impunity, leaving devastation in his wake. Where is he now? Lopez's current whereabouts remain a mystery. Is he alive, still lurking in the shadows, or has he met his end in obscurity? The thought that such a dangerous individual could still be out there is a chilling reminder of the gaps in our justice systems. As we piece together the fragments of this horrifying story, one thing becomes clear. We owe it to Lopez's victims and countless others like them to ensure that justice systems worldwide are better equipped to handle cases of this magnitude. Before you go, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the darkest corners of human history. Together, we can shine a light on the stories that demand our attention.